In the far reaches of the world, where the winds howl with the memory of ancient gods, and the sea crashes against jagged stone like a heartbeat, too wild to tame, there lived a people who carved their lives into the bones of the earth. These were the Vikings, seafarers, raiders, traders, but above all believers. Not in comfort, not in ease, but in meaning. For the Vikings, life was not a gift, it was a challenge, a trial, a proving ground, where every breath had purpose, and every moment was etched by the gods. To understand how they lived is not to count their battles or measure their ships, but to listen to how they spoke of wind and wave, to how they feared the silence of the gods more than the roar of war. For them, life began not in the womb, but in the thread spun by the Norns, 3 ancient sisters who dwelled beneath the roots of Yggdrasil, the world tree that held the 9 realms aloft. Verdandi and Skald, past, present, and future, did not ask what you wished to become. They decided. Before your first cry reached the air, your path had already been woven into the tapestry of fate. But this fate, though binding, was not a prison. The Vikings did not see life as something to endure, but something to meet head-on. They believed that honor was not granted, but seized. Every day a Viking stood against nature, against the unknown, against his own weaknesses, not because he thought he might live forever, but because he knew he would not. To die was not the enemy. To die without meaning, that was the deepest fear. Children were told tales not of peace, but of gods who bled, of heroes who died screaming with swords in hand, of monsters who could not be reasoned with, and of destinies that could not be bargained. These stories were not just entertainment, they were instruction. To be Viking was to walk in a world where your ancestors watched you, where the gods tested you, and where the spirits of the land listened to your every step. And yet amidst all this blood and ice, there was joy. Joy in a good hunt, in a full cup, in the laughter around a fire that crackled against the wind's howl. A Viking understood that life was made precious because it could be lost at any moment. That is why their songs rang so loud, why their dances defied the snow, why their voices rose in toast not only to the living but to the fallen. To eat well, to raise strong children, to protect the hearth, to speak truth, to fight with courage. These were not just choices, they were sacred duties, not because society demanded them, but because the gods were always watching, and they had no patience for cowards. At the heart of the Viking world pulsed Yggdrasil, the tree that connected all things, the world of men, Midgard, the world of gods, Asgard, the realm of the dead, Hell and others beyond naming. It was not a metaphor, it was real. Every Viking knew it. They saw its echoes in the forests, in the patterns of frost on their long ships, in the spiral of smoke from their hearth fires. To be born was to step onto the roots of Yggdrasil, and to die was to fall into its soil. They lived in cycles, day and night, season after season, planting and harvest, birth and burial. But unlike other peoples, the Vikings welcomed these cycles. They did not pray for time to stop. They prayed for the strength to keep pace with it. The harshness of life was not a cruelty, it was a teacher, and every scar was a lesson. They believed that the world had been born from sacrifice, that Odin Allfather and seeker of wisdom had given his eye to drink from Mimir's well, and hung himself on the world tree to learn the secrets of the runes, that the very bones of the first giant Ymir had become the land beneath their feet, that blood and suffering were not to be avoided, but embraced as sacred transformative acts. This is why they were unafraid to risk everything, why a farmer would pick up a sword and sail across a sea, why a mother would teach her son not just how to pray, but how to die with dignity, why they saw death not as a defeat, but as a door. For the Vikings to live fully was to live knowing that your death had already been written, and to meet it with your eyes open and your axe high. In the hush before battle, they did not tremble. They smiled. For if this was the end, then they would greet it as a friend. And if it was not, then fate had granted them another day to prove themselves. This was their truth. This was their breath. This was how the North lived. And beyond its shadows waited not in fear but in promise. For death was not a closing chapter. It was only the next page. To die in the world of the Vikings was not to vanish, it was to continue. The breath might leave the body, but the name, the deed, the spirit, they remained. And more than that, they travelled. The dead walked not into silence, but into one of many halls, each forged from the weave of fate and the weight of life lived. There was not one afterlife. There were many. Because death, like life, was not a single road, but a tree of paths, some noble, some grim, and others forgotten. At the peak of all promise stood Valhalla, the golden hall of Odin. Its roof was made of shields, its rafters of spears, and its benches long enough to seat all the heroes who had fallen with honor. This was not heaven. This was not peace. It was preparation for the final war for Ragnarok. Here the Einherjar fought each day, dying and rising again, sharpening their courage for a fate still to come. But not all who died in battle went to Valhalla, for even the bravest did not always catch the eye of Odin. Some were chosen instead by Freya, the goddess of love, beauty, and death. Half of the slain were taken to Fólkvangr, her tranquil field where they rested not in endless combat, but in balance, in harmony. Freya's warriors were just as honored, though their path was softer, more mysterious, less sung in saga, but no less sacred. They had fought not for glory, but for love, for kin, for cause. And Freya knew the worth of that sacrifice. But what of those who died not in battle? What of the old, the sick, the betrayed, the children? These were not cast away, but they walked a colder path. Their souls passed into Helheim, the underworld ruled by Hel, the daughter of Loki. She was not evil, though many feared her. Her hall was not a place of torment, but of waiting, a realm where the forgotten, the unspoken, the uncelebrated lingered beyond the reach of songs. Cold, yes, shadowed, but not cruel. Hel's kingdom was a mirror of the world, a place where the memories of what once was drifted like fog. Those who had lived without glory still found rest. But it was a quiet rest, a long, dim dusk without dawn. It was not punishment. It was absence. And some did not find their way at all, their names lost, their deeds faded, no one to speak of them, no story, no stone. These souls wandered, nameless, rootless. These were the Draga, the restless dead, not ghosts, but echoes, spirits twisted by unfinished vengeance, unspoken sorrow or pride, too heavy to die. They walked the earth, haunting their own graves, attacking the living, seeking what could no longer be given meaning. They were reminders to the living that to be remembered is to remain, and to be forgotten is the true death. This fear of being forgotten drove the Viking heart more than any sword at his throat. It is why they carved their stories into runes, why they sang of their ancestors, why they raised burial mounds on high cliffs, where the sea could never ignore them. To die was not shameful, but to die without story that was unthinkable. Funerals were not mere ceremony, they were sendings. Fires lit upon ships, flames crackling like the song of the gods, carrying the soul to the realm it deserved. The higher the flame, the greater the legacy. And when no ship was given, stones were raised instead, steely upon the land, carved with names, deeds, prayers. Stones could not sing, but they could endure. The dead were not gone. They were always near, in the wind, in the flame, in the dreams of warriors and the whispers of seers. And sometimes they returned. Volvas, the seeresses of the north, could speak with them, not often, not easily, but in sacred rites beneath sacred trees, the veil between worlds could thin. And when it did, the wisdom of the ancestors might rise again. This was not superstition. It was faith, not blind, but built upon generations of signs, dreams, visions. The Vikings believed because they had seen, because the world was full of signs for those who knew how to read them. A raven flying west before battle, a branch that breaks with no wind, a flame that refuses to die. Each death echoed into the living world. Each life rippled into the next. The Vikings did not ask if there was life after death. They asked what kind of death would lead to a worthy life. They asked whether their choices honored those who came before. They asked what story would be told when they were gone. And if that story was strong enough, if it was carved deep enough into the bark of the world, then death would not end it. It would only lift it higher. This is how they understood the end, not as an end at all, but as a new song sung by those left behind, and in the quiet after the song faded, only one question mattered. Will they speak your name, high above the thoughts of men and deeper than the roots of Yggdrasil, beyond what even the gods could fully master there, spun three shadows known by every Viking heart, the Norns. Wood, Verdandi, Skuld, the past, the present, the future. But they were not merely goddesses. They were older than names, older than time itself. Even Odin, the All-Father, who drank from the well of Mimir and pierced himself upon the world tree to learn the runes, bowed to the Norns. For they held not just the fates of mortals, but of gods. To the Vikings, fate Erlög was not a cruel decree, but a sacred framework. It was not a punishment. It was not arbitrary. It was woven thread by thread, action by action. The Norns sat at the base of Yggdrasil, where the waters of destiny pooled like memory made liquid, and there with hands that had never aged, they spun and cut, twisted and tied. Each life was a thread, each death a knot, each legacy a pattern. To be born was to be given a thread in the great tapestry. But how that thread was woven through the world by courage, by betrayal, by silence, by thunder, that was shaped by choice. The Vikings did not believe they could escape fate, but they believed they could face it with honor. This is the paradox of Viking destiny. It is fixed, and yet it demands your will. You cannot change your end, but you can decide how you meet it. In that decision lies your worth. Odin himself knew his fate. He knew he would die at the jaws of Fenrir. He had seen it. He chose it. He did not try to prevent it. He prepared for it. And that is why the Vikings revered him. Not because he was invincible, but because he was bound, and yet still fought. To the Viking mind, to know your doom and still walk toward it, that was the essence of greatness. In the longhouses of the north around firelight flickering against wooden walls, old warriors told tales of heroes who rode into storms they could not survive. Not fools, not suicides, but men and women who understood that the mark of a soul was how it burned in the final wind. Children learned early you cannot plead with the Norns. You cannot bribe fate. You can only live so fully that when your time comes, your thread is bright and strong and worthy of being woven into the next story. And so fate was never something feared. It was watched for. Dreams mattered. Omens mattered. The turning of the sky, the pattern of birds, the slip of ice beneath a warrior's foot. Nothing was random. Everything meant something. The Norns whispered through the smallest things, and the wise listened. Seers Völvers travelled from village to village, cloaked in furs and secrets, speaking the tongues of gods and spirits, interpreting the will of fate. They were revered, feared, sometimes cast out, when their words came too close to painful truths. But no hall would ever truly bar them, for who would turn away the voice of destiny? Even kings bowed when a Völver spoke. In one legend, Osiris told a young warrior, "You will die at sea beneath a black moon with your blade lost and your name shouted into the wind." The warrior wept not in sorrow, but in gratitude. He knew now the shape of his death, and so he made every day a step toward it. When that black moon came, he laughed, and as the sea swallowed him, he shouted his own name into the storm, just as the Norns had written. This was not nihilism. This was reverence. The Vikings believed fate was a map written in a language only the brave could read. They built their lives around it not to fight it, but to walk alongside it like a wolf at their heel. Fate was a companion, sometimes silent, sometimes cruel, but never meaningless. There were those who tried to escape it, who ran from war, who broke oaths, who betrayed blood. And these men died just the same, but no one sang of them. Their names did not echo. Their threads were dull forgotten. And that was the greatest curse. For if your thread was not strong, it would be cut and dropped into the soil, and the roots of Yggdrasil would not drink your memory, and the Norns would not touch you again. But if you lived with fire, if you walked into your fate as if you had chosen it, if your blade found light even in darkness, then your thread would gleam like iron in moonlight, and the gods would smile, because in the end, destiny was not the end of freedom. It was the proof of it. What does it mean to live a life so fierce, so full, so unforgettable that even death cannot silence it? The Vikings knew. They did not believe immortality lived in the body. They knew bones cracked, skin withered, and fire consumed all flesh. But memory was stronger than fire. Story was stronger than stone. To be remembered was to remain, not in heaven, not in hell, but in the heartbeat of the world itself. This is why they carved runes into standing stones, built great burial ships, and sang the sagas of the fallen long into the deepest nights. Because for the Viking, legacy was not something left behind. It was something sent ahead, like an arrow loosed into eternity. To have your name spoken after death was a second life. To have it sung, that was godhood. The Skalds, the poets, were more than entertainers. They were architects of legacy. With harp and voice, they shaped the memories of men. A warrior who fell nameless in a skirmish could become a legend in the mouth of a Skald. A king who died with cowardice could vanish from history, erased by silence. The sword earned glory, the song gave it roots, and so legacy became the final realm the Vikings sought to master. Not just living well, not just dying well, but being remembered well. This is why the halls of the dead rang with laughter, not only from battle, but from tales. The afterlife was built not just by gods, but by the ones who remembered the fallen, who repeated their victories, their flaws, their final words. And in this sacred ritual of remembering, each Viking became a brick in the wall of something larger than themselves. They believed that Yggdrasil's roots did not only hold the 9 worlds, but also held the stories of the dead. That in each gust of wind, each howl of wolf, each crash of sea against rock, was the echo of someone who had once breathed, loved, fought, and bled. In this way, the Vikings saw existence not as a line, but as a circle. Life fed death. Death fed story. Story fed the next life. The child who grew up hearing of her ancestors' bravery might one day step into battle not alone, but with that memory burning like a second heartbeat. But not all legacy was clean. Some stories festered. Betrayers, oath-breakers, men who sold kin for silver. These too were remembered, but as warnings. To be cursed in song was worse than death, for the dead cannot defend their name. Only the living can carry it forward or bury it deeper. Thus, the Viking was careful not only in battle, but in speech, in honor, in how he raised his children, in how he greeted strangers, because any moment could be the one that defined his name forever. And so, in the flicker of a fire, an old warrior might tell a tale like this. There was once a man named Eric Flameye. He stood alone at the bridge of Skogafjall when 50 came against him. He did not flee. He did not call for help. He planted his feet. He smiled. And when he died with laughter on his lips and a broken sword in his hands. They say the river still runs red where he stood, and no bird flies over it without crying out. That is not history. That is legacy, and it matters more. Because history fades, legacy grows. Even now, centuries later, we remember their names. Leif Erikson, Harald Hardrada, Lagertha, Bjorn Ironside. Not just for their victories, but because they lived as if the world watched, as if the gods themselves would whisper their stories into the next age. The Viking mind was not obsessed with death. It was obsessed with making death mean something. That is why even in the coldest grave, a Viking might rest easy, knowing their story would rise long after they had fallen. And in this belief lies their immortality. Because as long as the sagas are sung, as long as the mead is poured, and the flames dance in halls real or imagined, the spirit of the North endures. Not just in sword and horn, but in story. The final and greatest power, more lasting than gold, more sacred than breath. The Vikings lived hard. They died bravely. And they were remembered because they chose to be.